Welcome to Silver Serenades, romance told gently for hearts seasoned by time. Tonight's story is Waves of the Heart, a quiet seaside beginning where teapots, poetry, and patient tides carry love home again. Chapter 1. The Quiet Arrival. Margaret Hayes leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the bus window as the coastal highway curved toward its final stop. Beyond the glass, the Atlantic stretched wide and endless, its surface catching the soft light of early afternoon. Waves curled like pages being turned by a patient hand, rolling and retreating against the pale sand. After 4 decades of city living, traffic horns, subway rumbles, and office phones that never stopped, this sight felt like a gift wrapped in salt air. She had sold her apartment 2 months ago, donated furniture her children did not want, and packed only what mattered. Her late husband's watch, a box of family photographs, her journals, and a teapot she swore made every cup taste better. The bus hissed as it pulled into the small station. Margaret stepped down carefully, her knees stiff from the ride, and breathed deeply. The town smelled of the ocean, brine and seaweed, with a faint sweetness of wild roses that grew along the dunes. A sign painted in cheerful blue letters greeted her. Welcome to Windward Cove. The station was little more than a wooden bench beneath an awning. A handful of locals gathered to meet passengers, waving and calling out greetings. Margaret, suitcase in hand, felt suddenly shy. She was not young anymore, not stepping into a new adventure with the boldness of 20. She was 68, widowed, retired, and unsure whether she was brave or foolish for starting over. Her cottage was a short walk from the station. The realtor had assured her it was quaint and manageable. Margaret found it exactly so. White clapboard with green shutters, a porch facing the water, and a garden thick with lavender and sage. The front steps creaked, and the screen door protested with a squeal, but the house seemed to sigh with welcome when she opened the windows. By evening, she had unpacked the essentials and brewed tea in her favorite pot. She sat on the porch with her cup and listened to the ocean's steady breathing. For the first time in years, she felt no need to hurry. The next morning, Margaret walked into town. The main street was lined with weathered buildings, cafes, a bakery with cinnamon in the air, and shops that displayed seashell crafts and hand-knit scarves. At the corner, a bell above a door jingled as she stepped into a bookstore. It smelled of paper and sea air, of stories waiting patiently to be read. Shelves rose high, filled with worn spines and handwritten labels. At the counter stood a man with silver hair, neatly combed, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he read from a hardbound volume. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was immediate, warm as sunlight through a window. "Good morning," he said. "Welcome to Reed's Seaside Books." Margaret returned the smile, adjusting her scarf. "Good morning. I thought I'd take a look. I've just moved here." "Then you're already one of us," he replied with a quiet chuckle. "I'm Thomas Reed. This shop has been my stubborn passion for nearly 20 years. And you are?" "Margaret Hayes," she hesitated, then added, "retired, new to Windward Cove." "Well, Margaret Hayes," he said, closing his book, "you found the right place. Every newcomer eventually wanders through these doors. The ocean brings them, I think." She wandered among the shelves, tracing spines with her fingertips. He joined her, pointing out sections. The left wall is fiction, the back is history, and poetry hides near the window where the light is best. Margaret stopped at a row of novels she had loved in college. "You have all the old favorites," she said softly. "Favorites deserve to stay," Thomas answered, "even if they don't sell often. They remind us who we were." She glanced at him, noticing the kindness in his expression, the way he seemed to mean every word. For a moment, Margaret felt a flicker inside her chest, not the rush of youth, but the gentle spark of being seen. When she left, a slim book of poetry tucked in her bag, Thomas walked her to the door. "You'll come back," he said, not as a question, but as a certainty. Margaret stepped into the bright coastal sunlight and smiled. "Yes," she replied, "I think I will." That evening, As the tide pulled foam across the sand and gulls wheeled above, Margaret sat on her porch with a poetry book open in her lap. She read the lines slowly, hearing in them the rhythm of waves. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard another rhythm, the low, steady timbre of Thomas Reed's voice. She closed the book and watched the horizon darken into twilight. For the first time since she had packed her life into boxes, she wondered if this move was not only about quiet solitude. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was about something or someone more. Chapter 2. Shelves, Shorelines, and Small Beginnings. The week folded open like a well-loved map, its creases guiding Margaret toward a rhythm she had not known she craved. Mornings were for the sea, a slow walk along the shoreline where gulls cried and the sand accepted her footprints with a soft hush. She learned the beach's language quickly, the way the tide left a lace of foam along the kelp, how the wind came cooler after mid-morning, why the flat, gray stones seemed to warm in her palm as if remembering sunlight. She brought home a small pail of shells each day, rinsed them in the kitchen sink, and arranged them in a shallow tray on the windowsill, their pale spirals catching light like whispers. Afternoons became Reed's time. Reed's Seaside books, and, by gentle extension, Thomas Reed. The bell on his door quickly learned the shape of her arrival. It chimed with an almost conversational cheer when she stepped inside. Thomas, most days in a blue cardigan with a pen tucked behind his ear, would glance up from the counter and greet her with the kind of welcome that made Margaret feel as if she were the best part of his day. New tied in, he would say, nodding toward the door as if her presence were another dependable cycle of the coast. In fair weather, she would reply, and the ritual, born by accident on her second visit, soon felt as natural as breathing. She explored the shop in longer arcs. At the back, she discovered a narrow alcove, just large enough for a small table and 2 chairs, a kettle, and a tin of biscuits. For the late afternoon lull, Thomas explained, pouring water over tea leaves in a little ceramic pot the color of sea glass. Books and tea share a sworn pact. One excuse is the other's indulgence. I brought my own sworn pact, Margaret answered, revealing her favorite teapot wrapped in a flour towel inside her tote. But I will not argue with your pot's good manners. He laughed, the sound warm and unforced. We shall declare a rotating diplomacy. Alternate days, alternate teapots. They tested the arrangement immediately. The tea made in his pot tasted faintly mineral and kind, as if the ceramic remembered every previous brew. Her pot, when enlisted the next afternoon, filled the alcove with bergamot and something floral that Thomas attempted to identify and finally christened contentment. Contentment pairs well with poetry, he said, passing her a saucer. I have a theory that older poems know how to sit with us in silence. They do not demand we prove ourselves. Margaret settled, grateful for the way his voice made room for quiet. Older people know that as well, she answered. We shed the habit of explaining. A retired schoolteacher named Alma became the first townsperson to adopt Margaret wholeheartedly. Alma drifted through the shop daily in a canvas hat sprigged with safety pins, purchased paperbacks for the price of a pastry, and paid for all of it with coins extracted from a tin marked bus fare. You are the new lady in the white cottage, Alma announced without prelude, examining Margaret over the rim of her spectacles. I approve. You walk as if you intend to stay. I do intend to stay, Margaret said, surprised by how certain it felt when spoken aloud. Good, Alma replied, sifting a stack of mysteries. Thomas, you will give her a town library card. I do not issue those, Thomas reminded her. The library does. You are a library with a cash register, Alma said briskly. Pretend, then, to Margaret, she added, there's a reading circle on Thursday afternoons. No rules, no obligations, only biscuits. You should come. Thomas lifted an eyebrow in polite interest, then glanced at Margaret with something like hope politely disguised as neutrality. The reading circle is a gentle crowd. They will feed you cake and opinions in equal measure. Cake and opinions, Margaret mused. A dangerous pairing, but she agreed, and on Thursday, she found herself in the back room with 6 other residents, each holding a poem like a seashell, tipping it this way and that to catch the tone hidden in its curve. When it was her turn to read, Margaret's voice wavered on the first lines before finding its sure footing. She read slowly, not dramatizing, only allowing the words to settle. When she finished, the group did not clap. They hummed, a collective note of appreciation that felt like a hand resting on her shoulder. Thomas, seated just to her left, poured more tea without comment. Though when their gazes met over the kettle's steam, she saw gratitude there, as if he were thanking her for trusting this small circle with her voice. After the reading, Alma insisted on escorting Margaret home. They walked side by side along the boardwalk, the sea throwing shredded lace at the pilings below. "You carry a long story in your eyes," Alma said, as if observing the weather. "Most of us do. Windward Cove is a harbor for such things." "I suppose mine is not unusual," Margaret answered, measuring her steps. "I worked many years. I raised children. I lost a good man. I came to the sea because it felt like a shore I might finally reach." "Loss does not enjoy comparisons," Alma replied, "but the sea is good with grief. It will hold it without trying to fix it. People often mistake fixing for love." She stopped, turned, and offered a bright, quick smile. "Thomas does not make that mistake." Margaret felt the small, telling stir somewhere beneath her ribs. "No," she said softly, "he does not." The days continued to shape themselves. She learned the cadence of the town bells, the particular cheer of the baker who always added an extra roll to her bag by accident, the shortcut behind the post office that led to a narrow staircase down to the beach. She bought a sturdy basket for groceries and a light scarf the color of sea foam. She began to sleep through the night, a thing she had not managed with any regularity since her husband's last illness, waking to the hush of surf and the clean, salt-smelling light. One afternoon, a squall came up fast, the sky folding itself in a slate and pushing a quick, pelting rain across the cove. Margaret, caught on the far side of town, ducked into the bookstore with a laugh that surprised her with its youth. The bell jangled as if equally delighted. "You found our indoor weather," Thomas said, moving to shut the door. Rain stitched the street outside into a rippling curtain. "Dea, please." She shook water from her scarf and smoothed her hair, then slipped into the alcove. Thomas arranged cups as if every movement were part of a small, shared ceremony. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, once they were settled. "What did you do in the city? If the question is too forward, blame the rain. It makes everything sound like conversation." Margaret took a breath. She disliked listing titles. They always felt like labels pasted on a glass. "Still," she answered, "I manage people, budgets, teams, deadlines. It was a good career, and I'm proud of it. But I spent so much time looking at calendars that sometimes I forgot the shape of a day." She traced the rim of her cup. "When my husband died, the days kept their shapes without him, and I resented them for it. I kept going because that is what one does, but in the evenings I would open the window to hear traffic and pretend it was the ocean." "The ocean is better at being the ocean," Thomas said gently. "Yes," she agreed, the smile arriving without effort. "It is." The rain persisted, drumming a steady rhythm on the awning. Margaret looked toward the front window, where droplets chased one another down the glass. A thought rose, surprising in its clarity. "I would like to help here," she said. "Not every day, not with pay. Do not protest, Thomas, but to shelve, to brew tea for the circle, to read stories on a Saturday morning if you host children. I know how to be useful, and I have time." He set his cup down with careful precision, as if the table had suddenly acquired great significance. "I would be honored," he said, sincerity soft and unmistakable. "There is more to do than my two hands can manage lately. Tourists in summer, visitors in autumn. I am grateful for all of them, but I refuse to banish the old novels to make room for glossy calendars. A stubborn principle is lighter work when carried with a friend." "A friend," she repeated, the word fitting neatly, like a book sliding into its place on a shelf. "Then consider me enlisted." They drew up a simple plan right there at the tiny table. Margaret would come in on 2 afternoons each week to straighten displays, brew tea, and greet newcomers. She would curate a small shelf labeled Sea and Solace, poetry, memoir, and quiet novels that did not shout. Thomas would handle the ordering and the ancient cash register that added with the solemnity of a church organ. The storm cleared as quickly as it came, leaving the street glossy and bright. When Margaret stood to leave, Thomas reached for her umbrella. Clear plastic, dome-shaped, another small ritual that felt like kindness made visible. He held the door and, in a voice more tentative than his actions, said, "Margaret, might you join me for a walk when the tide turns this evening? They say the glass floats sometimes wash ashore after a storm." "I would like that very much," she said, and the words were no more complicated than truth. They met at the end of the boardwalk as twilight softened the sky. The water, calmed by the passing squall, lifted and fell in breath-like motions. They walked without hurry, pausing to examine every glint. They found no glass float, only a bottle-green shard rounded smooth as a pebble. But the searching made them companions in a small adventure, and that seemed the rare treasure. "Tell me," Thomas said after a time, "what did your husband love best?" The question landed like a hand placed lightly at the small of her back, guiding without pressing. Margaret tipped her head, considering. "He loved fixing things. Radios, lamps, the hinge on a jewelry box that had been stubborn since I was young. He believed that attention was the plainest form of love." She held her breath a beat, then added, "He died in a way that could not be fixed, and I have made my peace with that, but I have not always known what to do with all the attention I still carry." Thomas nodded, eyes on the surf. "Perhaps you can set it down in places that need it. Window boxes, friends, the spine of a book handled kindly. Attention does not disappear when its first task is finished. It learns new work." They walked on, the last light glancing off the water. When they reached the pier, Margaret paused to watch two boys cast lines into the darkening surface, their laughter ringing like bells. A small intimacy rose in her, a wish both simple and astonishing. "Thomas," she said, turning to him, "would you let me bring sandwiches to the shop tomorrow? We can eat them in the alcove before the readings circle and argue about whether soup is a meal or an ingredient." His smile unfolded like one of the thin, old maps he kept in a drawer near the counter. "I will argue fiercely for its meal status," he said, "and I will be very grateful for your sandwiches." They parted at the corner where the street lamp made a pale island in the dusk. Margaret walked home with a steady step, the kind that knew where it was going. In the kitchen, she placed the bottle-green shard on the windowsill beside her tray of shells. It caught a stitch of lamplight and threw it back, faint but persistent. Before bed, she opened her journal and wrote in a hand that had not trembled since she left the city. 2 teapots, 1 shop, a squall, a plan. The sea likes to return what is worth keeping. Perhaps today, it returned a part of me I had not expected, useful, companionable, ready to belong again. When she turned out the light, the house listened with her to the hush and pull of the tide. Sleep came easily, and in the last feathered moment of waking, she thought she heard the bookstore bell ring. Its familiar chime crossing the quiet like a promise made in a tongue she now understood. Morning would bring bread and soup and a reading circle, and somewhere in it all, Thomas Reed's gentle humor and the dignified comfort of shelves that smelled of salt and paper. Margaret felt the tide within align with the tide without, and she smiled in the dark, certain that small beginnings were the surest kind. Chapter 3. Tea, Sandwiches, and Shared Stories. By mid-morning the following day, Margaret's kitchen smelled of dill and mustard. She had prepared sandwiches carefully, layering slices of tomato and cucumber with cheese, wrapping them neatly in parchment. A small thermos of soup, chowder, the sort that clung to a spoon, stood ready beside the basket. She felt a quiet pride, the kind that comes from doing something simple yet thoughtful. When she arrived at the bookstore, the bell jingled its welcome. Thomas looked up from arranging a stack of new arrivals, his glasses perched at the tip of his nose. "You've brought reinforcements," he said with a grin, noticing the basket. "Only modest ones," Margaret replied. "Soup and sandwiches. But you'll have to concede that soup is indeed a meal." "Ah," Thomas said, setting down the books. The debate begins. They settled into the alcove, where the small table was just wide enough to accommodate the basket, 2 bowls, and cups of tea. Rain from the previous night had left the air damp and cool, and the chowder steam rose like a blessing. "You've won your argument already," Thomas said after the first spoonful. "Soup is a meal, but I still maintain it depends on the soup." Margaret laughed softly. "You'll do well in a courtroom," Thomas read, "always leaving yourself an escape route." "Bookshops are the gentler courts," he answered. "We argue endlessly, but no one is ever sentenced, unless it's to read a book twice." As they ate, their talk shifted to stories of their younger days. Thomas told her about the first time he opened the shop, how he had worried no one would come, and how the townspeople had surprised him by arriving with armfuls of books to donate. They said, "If you're going to keep a shop here, you'd best stock it properly," Thomas recalled with a chuckle. "And I let them. Every shelf holds a piece of someone's life." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's why it feels so alive in here. The books have lived with people before. They carry fingerprints and folded corners. And tea stains," Thomas added, raising a brow. "Which I never mind. It means someone read with both hands occupied, book in one, cup in the other. That's a mark of devotion." Margaret considered this, feeling the truth of it settle warmly inside her. "My late husband used to say something similar about tools. He said a hammer with a worn handle was a hammer that had earned its place." Thomas looked at her with quiet understanding. "He must have been a thoughtful man." "He was," Margaret said softly. "We had a good life together. Not always easy, but steady." Silence stretched for a moment. Not uncomfortable, but tender. Then Thomas spoke, his voice gentler still. "I lost my wife nearly 15 years ago. Lillian. She had the kind of laugh that startled birds. The shop, it was what kept me from unraveling afterward. I'd come here each morning, open the door, and tell myself to keep going because stories deserve their keeper." Margaret reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on his. "I'm sorry, Thomas." He covered her hand with his other, not squeezing, only resting there as if they were balancing one another. "We carry them with us, don't we?" he said. "Our partners. They become the thread in the fabric of who we are, even as we make room for new colors." Margaret nodded, her throat tight, but not with sorrow, with gratitude. "Yes, that's exactly it." The bell at the front door chimed, pulling them gently back. Children spilled in, their laughter echoing through the aisles. Alma followed with her usual brisk stride, announcing, "Reading circle in 10 minutes, and I hope someone brought biscuits." "I brought sandwiches," Margaret called, rising. "But no biscuits today." Alma sniffed, then smiled. "Good enough. We'll survive." The reading circle gathered, a lively mix of townsfolk who debated poems as if they were discussing weather patterns. Margaret listened, contributed, and even read aloud again. She no longer felt like a guest. She felt, quite suddenly, like a part of the fabric Thomas had described. Later, after the group dispersed, Thomas walked Margaret to the door. The afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long golden streaks across the street. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the soup, for your stories, for being here." Margaret smiled, her heart light. "I think this town will suit me, Thomas. And perhaps your bookshop most of all." He held her gaze, and in that look was something unspoken yet unmistakable, the first stirrings of more than friendship. Margaret felt it, warm as the sun on her back, steady as the tide rolling in and out. She stepped into the sunlight, the basket on her arm, and thought, perhaps this chapter of life is not an ending after all. Perhaps it is the beginning of a story I never expected to write. Chapter 4. Shoreline Conversations. The tide was low when Margaret met Thomas at the boardwalk. The late afternoon sun cast everything in gold, and the beach stretched wide, littered with driftwood and shells polished smooth by years of water's patience. A few gulls strutted near the waves, pecking at whatever treasures the sea had surrendered that morning. Thomas stood waiting, hands tucked into the pockets of his cardigan, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he saw her, he smiled in that quiet way of his, like someone recognizing an old friend across a crowded room. "You came," he said. "Of course," Margaret replied. "You promised glass floats, didn't you?" "Ah, yes," he chuckled, falling into step beside her as they began down the beach. "Though I should warn you, I found only 2 in 20 years, and both were so scratched you could hardly see the color." "Then we'll consider the search the prize," Margaret said, her eyes scanning the sand for glimmers. They walked slowly, the surf brushing the shore with its endless rhythm. Their conversation meandered just as easily. Thomas spoke of the town's history, the fishermen who once filled the harbor, the storms that had reshaped the dunes, the legends whispered about shipwrecks offshore. Margaret listened with genuine interest, appreciating the way he told stories not as facts but as gifts. "And what about you?" he asked after a while. "What brought you here, Margaret Hayes, aside from the sea itself?" She paused before answering. "I wanted a life with more room in it. The city was full always. Noise, people, responsibilities. I loved my work, but it consumed me. And after Robert passed, I realized I didn't need skyscrapers to keep me upright. I needed air. I needed the sound of something steady. So here I am." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "The sea does that. Holds us steady. Reminds us of time's patience." They stopped to examine a cluster of shells, their edges pearled and delicate. Margaret picked one up, tracing the spiral with her thumb. "Do you ever feel guilty?" she asked quietly. "About what?" "About still being here. About finding joy again when someone we loved can't." Thomas crouched to pick up a stone, rolling it in his palm before skipping it across the waves. "Every day for a long time," he admitted. "Until one morning, I realized Lillian wouldn't want me to live inside shadow. She loved stories, Margaret. She believed every chapter mattered, even the ones you didn't expect. So I stopped thinking of my joy as betrayal and started thinking of it as carrying her with me into new pages." Margaret's throat tightened. She looked out at the water, shimmering in the fading light. Robert loved fixing things. He'd laugh at me now, trying to repair my own leaky faucet. "I think he'd be glad I came here. He'd want me to find peace." "And maybe more than peace," Thomas said gently. She met his eyes. They were blue as the sea at dusk, steady and kind. She felt something stir inside her. Not the wild rush of youth, but the deep, surprising recognition of possibility. They walked on in companionable silence, their footsteps side by side in the damp sand. The sky deepened into rose and violet, and the first stars blinked above the horizon. When they reached the pier, Thomas stopped. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I know we're only just beginning to know each other, but I want you to know, I'm glad you came to Windward Cove. More glad than I can say." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "And I'm glad I wandered into your bookstore." They stood there a moment longer, listening to the waves lap against the pilings. Then Thomas offered his arm in an old-fashioned gesture, and Margaret accepted it with grace. Together they walked back toward the boardwalk, the tide whispering behind them, carrying both the weight of the past and the promise of what might come. That night, back in her cottage, Margaret placed the shell she had found on her windowsill beside the green shard from the storm. As she traced its spiral, she thought of Thomas's words. Every chapter mattered. For the first time in years, she went to bed not simply grateful for quiet, but eager for what tomorrow might bring. Chapter 5, What We Carry. Windward Cove settled into its autumn rhythm. The tourists had thinned, the boardwalk no longer crowded, and the bakery once again had enough cinnamon rolls for the locals. Margaret found herself woven into the town's fabric almost without realizing it. People greeted her by name at the post office. Alma dropped by with gossip wrapped in newspaper clippings, and the children from Reading Circle waved whenever she passed. But it was Thomas who had become her anchor. Their days found a quiet pattern. Mornings spent in her garden or on the shore, afternoons in the bookstore, evenings sometimes shared over tea. And yet, beneath the ease of it all, Margaret felt a weight pressing, something unspoken between them. One evening, she invited Thomas to supper at her cottage. She roasted chicken with rosemary and baked a small apple tart, the kind her husband once loved. When Thomas arrived, carrying a bottle of wine and a well-worn volume of Yeats, she realized how natural it felt to open her door to him. They ate slowly, the conversation easy, books, town news, The ridiculousness of Alma's latest declaration that the seagulls were conspiring. But when the dishes were cleared and the tart had been cut into neat slices, Thomas grew quieter. He turned the stem of his wineglass between his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "Margaret," he said finally, "may I ask you something difficult?" Her heart gave a small, nervous beat. "Of course." "Do you ever wonder," he began, "if we're too old for this? For beginning again? For risking our hearts when we've already known both love and loss?" Margaret sat back, the question striking something deep. She thought of Robert, of their long marriage, of the ache of losing him. She thought of nights alone, when the house had felt far too large, and of the quiet joy she felt now when Thomas entered a room. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I wonder all the time. I worry my children will think I'm being foolish, or that people will laugh at the sight of us holding hands. And most of all, I fear what it would mean to lose again, to build something only to have it torn away by time." Thomas looked at her, his eyes steady. "That's what I fear too. Lillian's death hollowed me out for years. I told myself I'd had my share of love, that it was greedy to want more. But then you walked into the shop, Margaret Hayes, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to look forward to tomorrow." Her breath caught. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "And I remembered what it felt like to be seen, to matter in a way that isn't just usefulness or routine." He turned his hand, threading their fingers together. "Maybe it's not about being too old. Maybe it's about knowing exactly how precious time is. At our age, love isn't foolish. It's deliberate, a choice." Margaret felt her eyes sting, but the tears were not sorrowful. They were tender, born of recognition. "Then I choose this," she said quietly. "I choose to see where it leads." Thomas's smile was small but sure. He lifted her hand and kissed it gently, reverently, as if sealing a promise. "So do I." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the kitchen clock. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that fills itself with trust. Later, after he had gone, Margaret stood by the window, watching the waves gleam under the moonlight. For years she had thought her heart was a closed book, its story complete. But now she understood, love was not about rewriting what had been. It was about turning the page to see what else the story might hold. And she found she was ready for every word still to come. Chapter 6, Family Tides. The cottage was rarely louder than when Margaret's children came to visit. On Saturday morning, her daughter Elaine arrived first, her car filled with the voices of two teenage grandchildren who burst into the house with laughter and the endless energy of youth. Her son David followed soon after, carrying a basket of groceries and his usual teasing grin. "Mom," Elaine said, hugging her tightly, "you look wonderful. Retirement agrees with you." "Or the sea does," Margaret replied with a smile. "Comein, settle. There's tea already brewing." The afternoon unfolded in a warm tangle of conversation, the children darting down to the beach while the adults sat in the living room. Margaret listened, content, but felt a prickle of nerves. She had told neither Elaine nor David about Thomas yet. It wasn't secrecy, it was hesitation. How could she explain something that felt so fragile and new? It was Elaine who noticed first. "Mom," she said, tilting her head, "you've been lighter lately. Happier. Is there someone special?" David raised a brow. "She's blushing. That's a yes." Margaret laughed, though her cheeks did warm. "You two are far too perceptive." She set down her cup, choosing honesty. "His name is Thomas Reed. He owns the bookstore in town." Elaine's eyes lit. "The bookstore by the boardwalk? I went in yesterday while the kids played outside. He's charming." David leaned forward, more cautious. "So this is serious?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "It's early, but it's real. He's kind, thoughtful, and I enjoy his company." Silence lingered a moment. Then Elaine reached for her hand. "Mom, I'm glad. Truly, Dad would want you to be happy." David nodded slowly, his expression softening. "As long as he treats you well, I'll support it." Relief swept through Margaret like a tide pulling back. "Thank you," she said simply. That evening, when Thomas stopped by with a basket of peaches, his quiet way of checking in, Margaret introduced him. Elaine greeted him warmly, David with reserved politeness, and the grandchildren immediately adored him when he showed them how to balance a peach pit on their fingertips. Later, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, Elaine leaned close to her mother. "He looks at you the way Dad used to, like you're the best part of his day." Margaret's heart swelled. She glanced at Thomas, who was laughing gently with the children, and thought, perhaps this is what love looks like the second time around. Not a blaze, but a steady flame that warms everyone nearby. That night, after her family had gone to bed in the guest rooms, Margaret stood at the window and watched the moonlight stretch across the waves. She felt gratitude, deep and unshakable, for the blessing her children had given her without even realizing how much it mattered. The tide rolled in, steady and sure, and Margaret knew her life was shifting with it. It is something richer, something still unfolding. Chapter 7. Storm Weather. October brought storms to Windward Cove. The sky darkened early, waves crashed harder against the shore, and rain swept in sheets that rattled the cottage windows. Margaret found she loved the drama of it, the way the sea reminded everyone of its power. But one storm carried more than wind and water. It carried doubt. It began with something small. Thomas had planned to meet Margaret at her cottage one evening with a new book he thought she'd enjoy. But as the storm rolled in, he did not appear. Margaret waited, the tea cooling on the table, worry coiling tighter with each gust outside. When at last he arrived, rain dripping from his coat, he looked weary. "Forgive me," he said, setting the book on the counter. "I was delayed. The roof at the shop was leaking again, and I had to manage it before the book suffered." Margaret tried to smile, but disappointment stung sharper than she expected. "You might have called." Thomas blinked, then sighed. "You're right. I should have. I simply forgot." The word forgot lodged in her chest. She remembered waiting for calls that never came in her younger years, the sting of being an afterthought. Though Thomas's eyes were full of apology, the shadow of old wounds rose in her. She busied herself with the teapot, her movements too brisk. "Understand, the shop comes first." His brow furrowed. "No, Margaret, that's not what I meant." But she was already setting cups down with a little too much force. Perhaps I expected too much. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of the kettle. Finally, Thomas stepped closer, his voice quiet but firm. "Margaret, look at me." Reluctantly, she did. His eyes were steady, storm gray and sorrowful. "I didn't forget you. I worried that if I left the shop, I'd lose a piece of what I've built. But standing here now, I realize I risked something greater by not being here with you." Her defenses softened, though uncertainty still lingered. "I've spent years telling myself not to rely on anyone. When Robert died, I had to be strong alone. Sometimes it's easier to believe solitude is safer." Thomas reached for her hands, rain still clinging to his skin. "And I've spent years telling myself love was behind me. That wanting more was selfish. But then you appeared, and I realized solitude isn't strength, it's armor. I don't want armor anymore." Margaret felt her throat tighten. The storm outside roared, the windows rattling. But in his words, she heard something steadier than any thunder. "I don't either," she whispered. He squeezed her hands gently. "Then let's promise this, to speak when we're afraid, to trust that honesty won't break us." Margaret nodded, tears warming her eyes. "Yes, no more silence." They stood there, hands clasped, while the storm raged around them. And as the waves pounded the shore, Margaret realized love at their age wasn't about perfection or certainty. It was about courage. The courage to be open, even when the past tried to close them off. When the storm finally eased, Thomas kissed her forehead with reverence. "You're not an afterthought, Margaret. You're the reason I look forward to tomorrow." Her heart swelled, and she believed him, truly believed him. Chapter 8. The Tide That Returns. The storm left the town washed clean, its streets glistening, its air sharp with salt. By morning, Windward Cove was alive with neighbors mending fences, sweeping porches, and sharing stories of rattling windows and overturned flower pots. Margaret walked into town with Thomas at her side, their steps unhurried, their hands brushing until they finally twined together without self-consciousness. At the bookstore, the roof repairs had held. A few buckets sat near the back wall, but the books were safe. Margaret helped Thomas mop the floor, both of them laughing at their reflection in the water. Two silver-haired figures, damp and determined, who had weathered more than one kind of storm. That evening, the town gathered for the annual harvest dance in the community hall. The wooden floor shone, strings of lights glimmered overhead, and the scent of cinnamon cider filled the air. Margaret wore a dress the color of midnight, her favorite scarf knotted at her throat. Thomas, in his simple gray suit, looked at her as though she were the brightest light in the room. When the band struck up its first slow tune, Thomas offered his hand. "May I?" Margaret smiled, slipping her fingers into his. "You may." They moved together across the floor, their steps steady, not perfect, but perfectly theirs. Around them, neighbors smiled knowingly, children darted between legs, and Alma clapped in time with the music. As the song ended, Thomas leaned close, his voice low but certain. "Margaret, I don't know how many seasons we're given, but I do know this. I want to spend each one with you. Not as a memory, not as a shadow, but as the chapter we're writing now." Her eyes shone, her heart steady. "And I want the same, Thomas. I thought my story was already told, but it turns out the tide had more to bring me." Applause rippled as the next song began, but Margaret hardly noticed. She and Thomas stayed in each other's arms, moving with the music, their laughter mingling with the notes. Later, they walked home beneath the stars. The sea whispered against the shore, the same eternal rhythm it had always kept, and Margaret thought of how love, like the tide, always returned, sometimes gentler, sometimes stronger, but always sure. On her porch, Thomas kissed her hand, then her lips, with the tenderness of a man who knew exactly what a gift the moment was. Margaret felt her heart open wide, not to erase the past, but to carry it forward, woven with the present. As she watched the waves glitter under the moon, she knew this was not a second youth or a fleeting spark. It was something steadier, something lasting. It was the tide of her heart, returned at last, and she was ready to walk beside it, beside him, for however many seasons remain. Thank you for spending this evening with Silver Serenades. If Waves of the Heart brought you a little calm and a little hope, tap like so others can find us. We post new, tender romances each week for Season Hearts.